Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. I'm very pleased to be joined today by former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who is absolutely an expert when it comes to Middle East policy. Yoram, it's great to see you today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, my honor to be on your podcast.
You published an article very recently that I'm going to share in the Zoom chat. So anyone who's watching on Zoom, you can look at it in the chat, and you're watching it on YouTube. It's encouragement to sign up for the Zoom versions of these briefings. You wrote an article called Beware of Islamic Terrorism, and I'd love it if you could share a little bit with our viewers what you wrote in that article and what we need to be mindful of.
Well, the article was written uh, against the backdrop of the unprecedented entrenchment of anti-US and anti-Western Islamic terrorism in the US and in Europe, faced by dramatic ineptness on the part of uh, policy makers in the US and in Europe. In the US, it's primarily the State Department. And also, we're faced with Islamic terrorism, which doesn't care whether it's a Republican presidency or Democratic presidency. This is the same Islamic terrorism that has haunted the United States since the beginning of the 19th century with the Berberis of North Africa. And they have not stopped haunting, afflicting the US. But in face of such clear and present lethal threat to the US, we have seen the State Department approaching Islamic terrorism through Western lenses, assuming that the Islamic terrorist organization, whether state terrorism like Iran, whether organizations like ISIS, Al Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, could be tempted by Western generosity, and they potentially could embrace Western values such as peaceful coexistence, compliance with agreements, and even human rights and democracy. The reality is that none of those assumptions have anything to do with Middle East reality. In fact, contrary to the State Department assumption that uh, Islamic terrorism could be induced by money talks, namely by financial and diplomatic bonanza. Islamic terrorists have been very determined to prefer fanatical ideology walk rather than money talk. And this has been part of the Middle East for the last 1400 years, where ideology transcends a standard of living. And this has to do with anti-US Islamic terrorism as well. Not only that, but the State Department has ignored one of the precepts of the Middle East, namely, terrorists bite the hand that feeds them. And once again and again, terrorists have proven that they are welcoming Western gifts, but they react by biting the hand that feeds them. The Ayatollahs of Iran proved that to the US. Saddam Hussein, who was courted by the US until the day of the invasion of Kuwait, proved it again. And the Islamic terrorists in Libya which was facilitated by the State Department in order to rise to power and topple the Gaddafi regime, proved that by lynching the American ambassador and two other American diplomats. And the only way for us to examine the success or failure of State Department's confrontation with Islamic terrorism is to examine the pudding, and the pudding doesn't taste very well. During the Obama administration, which supposedly should be amenable to Muslim regimes, to Islamic terrorists, the U.S. experienced the series of terrorism and Fort Hood terrorism in Texas, the Pensacola club I'm sorry, the Orlando, the club in Orlando, Pensacola was during the Trump's time, and San Bernardino terrorism during Obama. They could care less if it's Democrat or Republican in the White House. And one of the underlying shortcomings of the State Department approach towards terrorism has been gleaned through its attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood has been the largest Sunni terror organization in the world, not according to the State Department, but according to Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco and Jordan and Kuwait and Oman, namely every single Arab ally of the United States has the machete of the Muslim Brotherhood at their throat, but the State Department insists on referring to the Muslim Brotherhood as a religious, political, social organization, and that is the result of taking lightly the centrality of fanatical religious ideology. The State Department pays attention to violent actions, which are tactics. The way the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic terrorists should be approached is not only by paying attention to their violent actions, but mostly by their intent, which is driven by very radical fanatic ideology or strategy. Because otherwise you react to terrorism rather than preempt. And the way the US has approached terrorism, and I'm embarrassed to say the way Israel approached Islamic terrorism until October 7, was defense rather than offense, was reaction rather than preemption, was basically containment rather than bringing terrorism to submission. But for the State Department, ideology is secondary because as far as they are concerned at the State Department, terrorism is driven by social despair, political despair, diplomatic despair, and supposedly you don't react to despair by military means, you react by financial and diplomatic means, and this is played into the hands of the very smart, sophisticated terrorists. The State Department has always preached negotiation rather than confrontation with terrorists, but there is a problem because the State Department concept of negotiation is as a way to advance reconciliation, peaceful coexistence. Well, that's great. Other than the fact that the other side, Islamic terrorists, do not view negotiation as a tactic towards reconciliation. They view negotiation as a step towards bringing the infidel West, the great American Satan, to submission. And again, the proof is in the pudding. Islamic terrorism has been confronted by the US diplomatically in most cases for many, many decades, but never has it been so deeply and widely entrenched on US soil, on European soil, uh, basically laying out the groundwork for terrorism, which potentially could dwarf September 11. That does not suggest success for the way the State Department has attempted to face terrorism. The State Department believes that diplomacy, patience, generosity could induce terrorists into moderation, but they forget that leopards don't change spots, they only change tactics. And in the case of Islamic terrorism, uh, the vision, the ideology which they espouse are the spots which are not going to be changed, especially when we're talking about 1400-year-old spots. They do change tactics, and the State Department does not want to accept that, and therefore they have developed their alternative or alternate reality, which has only provided further boost, further tailwind to anti-US, anti-European terrorism, and last and not least, the awakening from such an alternate reality is not only essential for US own homeland security, it's also essential to advance the cause of peace and advance the cause of human rights in Iran, for instance, because currently the Ayatollah's regime is definitely the most ruthless and despotic and terrorist regime anywhere in the world, largely because the way it has been treated by the US and by the Europeans, which have tolerated the existence of the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. And the only way to free the people in Iran, the only way to minimize terror throughout the Middle East and the world is by changing that regime, which could come about once the State Department free itself of alternate reality and submit itself to the actual reality in the Middle East. I'm very much aware that actual reality is very frustrating, very inconvenient, pretty bloody, but that's the reality. Uh, in spite of the fact that alternate reality is very convenient and very peaceful, but alternate reality seized by the West has been the most effective engine of anti-American, anti-Western terrorism.
One of the things you write in your article is that this fallacy of how to understand and approach these radical elements, it doesn't just affect the West, but it also affects moderate voices in the Muslim world, in Muslim countries. Can you elaborate on that a little bit about how this is doing harm not just to Israel and to the US, but to countries perhaps like the UAE and others?
Well, certainly when you have State Department policy, which since February 2021, when Secretary Blinken walked into his position as Secretary of State, involved very rough pressure on Saudi Arabia, on the UAE, on Egypt on account of their approach towards Muslim Brotherhood terrorism, towards Houthi terrorism in Yemen. And at the same time, the State Department not only has pressured very pro-American Arab regimes, but has demonstrated eagerness to court and reach another accord with the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. That has produced tailwind to terrorism not only exercised by the Ayatollahs, but also Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and certainly terrorism throughout Africa and Asia, and I would say all the way to Latin America. And the reason has been that the U.S., by trying to appease or by courting the Ayatollahs of Iran, has projected weakness as far as Middle Eastern entities are concerned. And once you reflect weakness, then you simply invite more terrorism, not only at the expense of U.S. Homeland security, but at the expense of pro-U.S. regimes throughout the Middle East. My own assessment is that should the U.S. realize that based on the last 46-year track record of the American diplomatic options towards the Ayatollahs, economic sanctions against the Ayatollah, the last 46 years of 40 years of economic sanctions, 46 years of diplomatic option has presented to us a dramatically bolstered Ayatollahs of Iran. That does not suggest success for either economic sanction policy or diplomatic option policy. Diplomatic option has failed because it only whets the appetite of terrorists. Economic sanctions, even President Trump's first terms, maximum pressure crippling economic sanctions were reversible sanctions. President Trump indeed caused a major economic crisis in Iran, curtailing dramatically the capability of the Ayatollahs to proliferate terrorism and wars throughout the world. But by definition, economic sanctions are largely ineffective when it comes to apocalyptic, fanatically driven regime that do not care so much about money talks. They do care much more about fanatic ideology walk. And therefore, the 4 years of President Trump were very, very difficult for the Ayatollahs, but they were immediately reversible upon the end of President Trump's presidency. Right now, we have the second term of President Trump. He may want to resume economic sanctions, tough, crippling economic sanctions, but he should bear in mind that by definition, those sanctions are going to be reversible potentially by the next president. And in the process, not only will they be or could they be reversible, but by being reversible, they also bolster the Ayatollahs' posture of deterrence because the Ayatollahs have proven themselves capable of defying American pressure. And that does not bode well, not for the US and not for allies of the United States. The only way to bring or not bring an end, but to curtail dramatically the scope of war, the scope of terrorism, is by producing a regime change in Iran. Regime change would dramatically enhance the U.S. posture of deterrence throughout the world. A regime change in Iran would remove the machete from the throats of every single Arab ally of the US in the Middle East. Regime change in Iran is going to expand substantially the scope of the Abraham Accords by the Saudis joining the accord, by Oman, possibly Kuwait, certainly Iran, possibly Indonesia and other non-Arab Muslim countries, and something which is not less important, regime change in Iran would bring about freedom to the Iranian people who have, in most cases, most of the Iranians have rejected the Ayatollahs, but they don't have the sufficient power to topple the regime, which is the most despotic, ruthless, and terroristic in the world today.
So, Yoram, let me ask you a question. When you talk about regime change in Iran, there are obviously two ways that can happen. One is the internal, that the people of Iran rise up against this very strong regime. And the other option is this external force coming in, a Western coalition forcing a regime change in Iran. Is there any precedence, any other countries in the Middle East, any other times the US sought to facilitate a regime change that this could be modeled after and we could learn from the successes or the failures?
Well, certainly the US could learn from the mistakes involving regime change in Iraq. Certainly Saddam Hussein's removal, in my mind, was called for. However, why accompany it by handing over Iraq to Iran by allowing the Shiites of Iraq to rule the country? You don't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. You can learn from those mistakes and avoid them. Currently, every observer of Middle East, of global affairs, would have to recognize the fact that the Ayatollahs of Iran are the number one epicenter of regional and global instability, terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, and proliferation of advanced military systems, and certainly an epicenter of anti-American, anti-Western terrorism, aiming at bringing the great American Satan and the Western infidel to submission. This is not an assumption. This is constitutional as far as the Ayatollahs are concerned, and this is codified or bolstered by the daily school curriculum in Iran, by the Friday sermons in the mosque, and by the day-to-day action, policy making of the Ayatollahs. And certainly, if you want to minimize terrorism, you have to get rid of the head of this venomous octopus in Tehran. Could it be done peacefully? Absolutely not. Could it be done without cost? Absolutely not. But there are no free lunches. And policymakers in the West, in the US, have to decide, do they want to continue living under the threat of Iran's Ayatollah, which is bolstered by the year you look back at the Ayatollahs when they assumed power in February 1979. They were next to insignificant element globally, hardly regionally. Today, they are an element to reckon with globally. They supply military systems to Russia. And this type of imperialistic drive, this type of awesome capabilities which extend beyond the Persian Gulf and the Middle East and Africa, very deep into South and Central America, has been largely achieved due to an inept US policy towards the Ayatollahs. Anyone who is concerned about the cost of regime change, which requires military involvement in order to be achieved, but anyone who is concerned about the potential cost, you should ask yourself what would be the cost of facing a nuclear Iran, which is around the corner if we do not take care of the regime, if we do not produce regime change. And certainly, the cost of facing a nuclear Iran would dwarf any cost which the US, Israel, uh, should be expected to invest in order to bring regime change in a conventional Iran. Nuclear Iran would make it much, much more horrific and costlier.
Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, thank you so much for joining this briefing, sharing all of that with us. Very enlightening, very important conversation. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you a little bit of a modified schedule next week, so make sure to check your emails from IDSF. Our next briefing will be on Tuesday of next week, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.